How long does it take to stop craving sugar? A couple of weeks ago, I got into some crab meat that had sugar in it, and it absolutely drove me nuts. I have been off of sugar since 2008, and I thought, oh, I'll have some canned crab. And then about a half hour after I ate it, I started craving and like going through the kitchen and the pantry and eating all of the sugar that I could find. And I thought, what in the world happened? And I went back and I read the can of crab, and the second ingredient or the third ingredient was sugar. Now, why would a company put sugar in crab meat? Simple. It's a preservative, and also it's a flavor enhancer. And in my case, it causes cravings, which makes you eat a whole lot more food. Who knows? Maybe I would go back and eat more crab, and that would make more money for the crab can company, and everything would be wonderful because that's the way that marketing and capitalism works. We make you consume more than you actually need. However, I don't want to consume more than I actually need, especially not sugar. So I want to get off of sugar, get over sugar, and get over my sugar cravings. So how long does it take for those cravings to go away? And this is really important because there are two of the biggest falsehoods that we hear in terms of food and getting off of sugar and dealing with food addiction. Number one is that food and sugar addiction aren't real in the first place. And then that number two, and this is really important in terms of behavior, that if you stop eating sugar and sweets and treats, that if you try to eliminate them, that means that you will crave them more. This is not true. I mean, it might be true for people who've never had a weight problem or who've never had a sugar craving problem, but it is absolutely not true for people like me who are sugar addicts. The truth is not that eliminating sugar and the foods that break down to sugar will cause cravings. No, 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 no. Elimination will eventually ease and eliminate cravings. But the question is, how long does that take? And so I did a podcast last week, and I did some research and found some very good websites that talked about the mechanism of addiction and also the mechanism of quitting and how that can actually change the brain and help heal that craving. So here's what you're looking for. If you've tuned in to find out how long does it take to stop sugar cravings, it takes 14 months, according to a study by Volko and et al. That was done in 2001, that it takes 14 months to completely get those sugar cravings to stop by, what's the mechanism? By getting dopamine levels and receptors to turn to normal. So let me back up and talk about dopamine, because it is dopamine that is the mechanism for sugar craving. This is really important too. Dopamine isn't just the mechanism for sugar craving. It's also the mechanism for the motivation to do other things besides eating and addictive behaviors, whatever they happen to be, whether it's addiction to substances, alcohol, nicotine, or addiction to behaviors, for example, to a behavior like gambling or overeating. Interestingly enough, the overeating addiction has both elements: a substance, sugar, glucose, carbohydrates, and then also the behavior itself, the behavior and pleasure of eating. So let's talk about dopamine, the dopamine receptors, and what happens for sugar addicts like me. So what happens is when I eat sugar, or what I call concentrated carbohydrates, the carbohydrates that break right down into glucose, best example being white bread. As a kid, I used to crush white bread in my hand and then eat it in a couple of bites. I get this hit, this kind of euphoria. And the way I can express it is it's like euphoria and despair at the same time, because I'm literally getting the rush from eating these concentrated carbohydrates and the sugars. Dr. Vera Tarman talks about sugar addiction, and she has it herself and is in recovery from it herself, in that we believe that normal people who react normally to sugar and carbohydrates don't get the level of rush that we get from eating these concentrated carbohydrates. And as someone who used to use nicotine and used to drink too much alcohol as well, I am here to tell you that the rush from the cigarette, the rush from the glass of wine is very similar to the rush that I get from concentrated carbohydrates. I do not get this rush from eggs, proteins, fish, from this kind of semi-carnivore diet that I follow. I don't get the rush from the foods that work for me. And I think the most important thing that I want you to do if you're dealing with sugar or food addiction is claim the right to eat the foods that work for you. Claim that right, because there are going to be people who've never felt the rush, who've never felt the despair, who are going to tell you that the addiction isn't real. And even worse, they're going to tell you that the solution is not to get rid of the foods you're addicted to. They're going to tell you that the solution is to try to modify them, to consume them in moderation, to consume them like a normal person, which is impossible for you. So, how long does it take after the elimination of these substances? How long does it take for your dopamine response to return to normal? And according to this Volko study, and I will also link to the study in the notes on this podcast, it takes about 14 months. Now, that's a very long time. That's a very long time to be white knuckling your way through holidays and celebrations and times when people are offering you these kinds of foods. But the good news is, and this is from my experience and the experience with my clients and the people who've read Sugar Freedom, is that you can get relief from the cravings, for me, typically in 3 days. For a lot of us, those of us who've gone, I used to run these challenges at Gordon Studio where we would, get rid of sugar and lift weights for 6 weeks. And typically what we saw is that there were some people who got relief from sugar cravings within 24 hours, just one day. If they're reducing the foods that they crave with foods that nourish and satisfy them, we saw an easing of cravings in as little as 24 hours. If you're getting enough sodium and enough electrolytes, bone broth, any kind of broth to replace the sodium, you're not going to be getting the weakness and the headache and just the bad feeling that you get from coming off of sugar withdrawal symptoms. That if you're eating enough of the foods that work for you, which for me at that time would be simple proteins and vegetables that grow above the ground, if you're eating those, you're going to be getting full, you're going to be getting satisfied, and you can ride out those cravings, whether the really bad cravings last 24 hours or up to 3 days. Or for some of the people I worked with, we would see the cravings last for a week or two. But then, after that, you get what I call the Keto Euphoria, the Atkins Euphoria, the Atkins High. There's a transition point where your body starts to be able to burn free fatty acids instead of burning glucose, which I have another video that talks about this, switching to being a fat burner from being a sugar burner, and that at that point you have that transition and you start to feel much better. As a matter of fact, you can almost feel a kind of euphoria and this huge surge of energy because now you're running on free fatty acids. You've got that energy. Not only that, but we're talking about dopamine and the dopamine receptors now, is that there is that initial recovery. You're not hitting those dopamine receptors with the concentrated carbohydrates and the sugar. Because the way you can think about this, that I'd like you to think about when you're using your food substance, what's happening is it's like blaring music. And what do you do when you hear blaring party music? I mean, you might like it for a while. Let's say you go to a nightclub and you're hearing your favorite songs and you're dancing. But after a while, that blaring loud music starts to be upsetting and annoying. And all you want is for that music to be turned down. Well, the brain will do exactly that with dopamine and the dopamine receptors, is that finally the receptors will become less sensitive, and eventually they will get eliminated. And we can even think of it in terms of dopamine resistance. And I think one of the most important things that you have to understand about dopamine is that it doesn't just deal with pleasure. It also deals with motivation and the willingness to do the things that you enjoy. The biggest thing that I deal with when I get into the sugar and into the substances is something that we call anhedonia, which is the loss of pleasure. And it's the double whammy. It's the sugar double whammy. You don't just get obsessed with sugar, you lose your motivation to do the other things that bring you health and happiness. And for me, things like singing and dancing and writing and practicing my piano and my guitar. It's probably something different from you. It might be like, why don't I want to garden and go walk my dog? Because not only do these foods that overwhelm our dopamine receptors make us crave them, they also make us eliminate the things that bring us pleasure and joy. And one of the best things, and I'm going to read this to you from another article that I'll link to from the Hazelton Betty Ford Center, is this, that dopamine controls feelings of pleasure and also addiction, movement, and motivation. People repeat behaviors that lead to dopamine release. And that's probably the most important thing that I can tell you today is whatever your behavior is, whether it's eating the sweet things or the starchy things or the crunchy, salty things, is that the things that we do that release dopamine, we repeat them. We repeat those behaviors. And so what we need to do is break away from the overwhelming dopamine response, replace it with the activities that we love and enjoy, the wholesome activities, and understand that it's going to take some time. How long does it take the brain cells to recover, the dopamine receptors to recover? After 14 months, and this study actually dealt with people who were using methamphetamine, serious addiction, that it took 14 months for those dopamine receptors to return to normal. But the wonderful, wonderful news is that they can return to normal, and it doesn't take 14 months to feel better. If you are replacing sugar and concentrated carbohydrates with something else that nourishes and satisfies you, so replacing in terms of what you're eating, and then also replacing in terms of what you're doing. And I think one of the reasons that 12-step programs work well for addictions is that you're replacing meetings and contacts with other people. So you're replacing that addictive substance with community, with people who understand what you're going through. So it's that replacement. Boy, I feel bad. I really want to reach for a food substance, and instead you reach for the telephone, or you reach for community, or you reach for one of the activities that makes you happy. So what I would like to suggest to you is that you think about some activities that you enjoy that make you happy. And some of the best advice I've ever heard for this came from Clarissa Pinkola Estes, is that go back and think about the things that you enjoyed doing when you were about 9 or 10 years old, and see if you can bring that fun, that sense of play, that sense of joy back into your life, that sense of fun and joy that isn't created by substances. All right, and as I said, I'm going to go ahead and link to those articles. And I do these live videos kind of as a practice for my regular videos. So I'm going to go ahead and go back and do a regular edited video on this topic, because I think this topic is so important. Because if you can understand where the cravings are coming from and what you can do to turn them down, I think it really helps you to make the good choices that help you to live a healthy, happy life. So I will end with my motto, which is always be well and eat for yourself. And I'll see you back here soon on the Sugar Freedom channel. Like, subscribe, and share for more ideas on getting off of sugar and living a fulfilling life. All right, be well, everybody. Bye-bye.